We are live. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 49 of the TechForge podcast. I am your host, Dynamo Ned. And, well, normally we'd wait till the 52nd episode to celebrate a year, but we went back and checked, and it turns out we started this podcast exactly 367 days ago. So, happy 1 year anniversary for the TechForge podcast. We did have to skip a few weeks there for various reasons, but
Yeah.
I am proud of our accomplishment here on the show, and I am joined by my ever faithful co-host Hunter.
Hey, how's it going?
Glad you can make it once again. I know we took the July 4th week off because of the national holiday here in the U.S., but it turned out to be a good time to do so because now instead of talking about Super last week, Nvidia's new Super cards last week, and then having to hedge everything with, but Navi's coming later, now we can talk about all of them at once.
Mm-hmm.
And it is an interesting discussion because all of those cards have really shaken up the mid-range market. Navi in particular, but the Super cards are giving them solid competition, even if they aren't quite as good value for money. But we'll get to that. Anyway, we're going to start with something a little less controversial and a little bit sad. Our last episode, we talked about the release of the new Raspberry Pi 4, which solid little single board computer, except they implemented the USB-C charger in a way that means that some charging cables don't work correctly with it. All so that they could save the use of a single resistor on the USB-C charging port. So let me share the article here with our audience and present to everyone. So this is from Brad Chacos over at PC World. The Raspberry Pi 4's new USB-C charging doesn't work with some USB-C chargers. And it turns out it's all due to the fact that, they decided to share a resistor instead of using two of them. So, you see pictured there the Raspberry Pi 4. We talked about last time its specs and features. We won't go into that. But it's a $35 single board microcomputer that you can use for all kinds of wonderful things. You can use it as a desktop replacement for light everyday productivity. You can use it as the basis for a project. A lot of people tend to use them as for RetroPie and for emulators, or you could use it as the brains for your new robotics project. Or one of the more interesting applications I saw is they use the Raspberry Pi webcam extension coupled with the fact that you can run a full Linux server, a full Linux web server on the Raspberry Pi. It was a family wanting to monitor whether their chickens were in the coop or not, so they could know when they could go collect the eggs. Because they didn't want to disturb them while they were on the nest, because they wanted to hatch out some chicks, but they wanted to still be able to go out and get the eggs when it was not time for brooding. And so they took a Raspberry Pi, hooked up the Raspberry Pi camera extension to it, and basically had a 24/7 video feed of the inside of their chicken coop. So the Raspberry Pi is useful for a lot of things, but, well, what we have here is a cost-saving measure causing problems. So basically, the USB-C charger right here that's supposed to charge the device doesn't work with some USB-C chargers because they didn't implement the charger the way the USB-C spec shows it to be. Now, this isn't an uncommon issue. There's some well-known examples of devices that use a USB-C charger, but that don't work with some USB-C cables. The Nintendo Switch is a particularly notorious one in that it uses a non-standard USB-C port that doesn't work with all cables.
Yep.
And early on in the standard's history, there were a number of early phones and laptops that wound up being fried by cables that didn't follow the spec. But in this case, the Raspberry Pi 4 is the problem. According to Tyler Ward, the Raspberry Pi 4 uses incorrect detection circuitry on the Pi end of the USB connection. As it says here, the $35 micro PC shares a single resistor for 2 of the USB-C port's pins, while the official USB-C spec calls for each pin to get a resistor of its own. So this means that certain more powerful cables called E-marked USB-C cables will not work with the device. We go down here, what happens is when attached to these E-marked cables, it detects the E-marked cable as an audio adapter accessory rather than a charger, and so it refuses to charge from the device. They have an engineer from Google here who says, instead of trying to come up with some clever circuit, hardware designers should simply be copying the figure from the USB-C spec exactly. It's actually normative, meaning mandatory, required by the spec in order to call your system a compliant USB-C power sync. Just copy it. Thankfully, one of the co-creators of the Raspberry Pi, Mr. Eben Upton, told Tech Republic that this will be fixed in a future board revision. And that should be expected to roll out in the next few months. In the meantime, if you've already bought a Raspberry Pi 4, you can get one of the official chargers for about $8. So if you use the official Raspberry Pi power supply, the one they have shown here in the photo right here is actually the one designed for the UK, but you can get the official one for the United States as well. And again, it's about $8. Just don't use any of the high power USB-C cables that are E-marked, and you generally won't suffer the problem. But sadly, that's not the only woe that the Raspberry Pi has encountered. So over at Android Central, Jerry Hildenbrand asked the question, does the Raspberry Pi 4 need a heatsink? And they have the best answer here. Under normal conditions, it runs great without any sort of external heatsink. And the software throttling keeps everything within safe operating temperatures. But if you're using custom software or are overclocking, you probably want to use a set of quality heatsinks. Now, Hunter, I think you have the same Kana kit that I got for the Raspberry Pi 3 that came with a set of heatsinks.
Yeah, and I put those on.
And those worked really well with the Raspberry Pi 3.
Yeah. I have actually seen a fan, I guess like a traditional CPU, desktop CPU, heatsink and fan for the Raspberry Pi processor, Raspberry Pi 4 processor. It was interesting. I'm not sure exactly where you would plug it in, plug the cable in, but it's not like that. It's like with an actual fan on it.
Yeah, I've seen those as well, but for most applications, those are probably overkill.
Oh yeah, I would say so.
But yeah, the Raspberry...
Maybe,
Go ahead.
maybe if you're overclocking, it would probably be good to have a fan to cool it. Let's see. Yeah, there's a little 5-volt fan Miniature 5-volt cooling fan for the Raspberry Pi.
Hmm.
Noctua actually makes a fan for it?
Who does?
Noctua NF-A4X10 5-volt. It's a 10.
Um, can
That can't be
you
right.
can you send me that link so I can show our viewers?
Yes. It might seem like it's right, but it's 40 by 10 nanometer brown, so this probably is right. Here it is in the Facebook chat.
Okay. 1 second while I get this pulled up. Okay. So yeah, let me share my screen once again. Here we are. So yes, the Noctua NF A4 X10 5-volt. This is a 40 by 10 millimeter fan.
I mean, that makes sense for the size, but that also seems like it's overkill.
I've used 40 millimeter fans before in a project. They are loud and they spin really fast.
I found another one that looks to be built for Raspberry Pi. I'll show that to you too. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, you can actually. Oh, I see where you plug it in. Okay. Yeah, so the pins that are sticking up on the Raspberry Pi is where you'd stick a fan power plug.
Okay, yeah. I've seen this one from Adafruit. I mean, Adafruit's generally where I go for any of my Raspberry Pi stuff anyway. But yeah.
Oh, I do see that the Noctua. I see a picture of a video. Yeah, the Noctua fan does fit on the Raspberry Pi, even though to me it seems crazy. And it does fit. The three pin cable does fit in the stack of pins that are on that would normally be for a breadboard.
Right. It uses 3 of the GPIO pins.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, if you're overclocking, it would make sense to put a um, miniature traditional heatsink CPU heatsink fan on it.
Definitely. I know I read a guide not long after Raspberry Pi 4 came out on Tom's Hardware, of all places, specifically on how to properly overclock the Raspberry Pi 4.
Hmm.
And it turns out you can crank the clocks by about 300 megahertz. Although, if you go past about 1750 megahertz, it starts to get unstable.
And I just looked up overclocking for it, and I see a picture for a video of it says Raspberry Pi overclocking failure, and it's burning.
Oh no.
Actually on fire.
Oof.
At least it's only $35. You're not, burning a whole desktop system.
Right. And that's the appeal of the Raspberry Pi, is
Yeah.
that it is a super cheap PC that, while not necessarily disposable, is of relatively low cost that if you do break it or you brick it, you're not out that much.
And one cool project that I've seen for this, and I'll try to keep it brief, is a smart mirror for the bathroom.
Yes, I've seen that project.
How it was a lot of work to it, but it definitely looks like it pays off at the end. The other cool thing is you can build a phone. You can probably build some kind of phone. You could build a tablet. There's a 7-inch screen that you can put in it, and there's a portable battery that you can. If you have a
Mm-hmm.
3D printer, you can 3D print a case for it. I saw Ben Heck. He did it was either Ben Heck or somebody else, most likely Ben Heck. He's like the maker genius. Um, he did a controller that looked like a DS controller or not a DS controller, the Sega or pretty much like the 2DS, but it looked like the Sega Genesis handheld back in the day.
Uh,
So it had the underneath the screen was the he took a controller for a console. I don't remember which one it was. Might have been the PlayStation 4, I think. I think probably PlayStation 4 because you take out the uh, trackpad and then you put a screen in it in that place. And he had to remap all the buttons, and so he put the Raspberry Pi underneath it, the controller, and he had also had a battery pack inside of it. So that was really cool. A lot of work and, of course, machinery parts that I don't have and machine stuff I don't have. But there's there's also a book. Like if you're interested, whoever's watching this, interested in seeing what you could do with a Raspberry Pi. I mean, you could put a cluster together and make some computer thing. We've shown uh, a kid's laptop. Um, there is a book for 40 or more projects you can do with a Raspberry Pi 3 because that was what was out at the time. There's plenty of videos. I'm looking at some kits on with an LCD screen on Amazon right now. There's a Plex server. You can build a media server and
mm-hmm.
have USB sticks, like shoot, 128 gig USB stick, USB 3, since it has two USB 3 ports, so fast video playback and supports 4K monitors. So shoes, really cheap, relatively cheap Plex server or Kodi server or whatever. Kind of like, and then yeah, retro games. So you can kind of build like a sort of PlayStation 3 um, media server. I just remember that the PlayStation 3 back in the day was good as a media server and of course as a game system. I
Right.
never owned one, but I had a friend who owned one, and he showed me the media server part, and it's like, that's awesome.
Yeah. Sadly, they locked down that functionality on the PlayStation 4.
Yeah.
But no, you were speaking of projects with the Raspberry Pi. This is one I've been working on. This is what's called a Motorola laptop. This was originally designed for a smartphone. It was designed to connect up to the Motorola Droid Bionic way back in 2010.
I think I
A
remember
lot of
that.
people bought the phone but didn't buy the laptops. And so a couple of years ago, you could buy these things for less than $50 off eBay.
Hmm.
And it's called a laptop because if you open it up, it's literally a laptop shell with a 11-inch screen, a decent keyboard, a touchpad, and mouse buttons. And all you had to do was plug your phone into the back here and then plug the power supply to charge the battery that's contained in the lap dock,
Hmm.
and you could have a portable laptop out of your phone. Well, you can take the same logic and using a couple of adapter cables, connect it up to your Raspberry Pi, and have yourself a Raspberry Pi powered laptop.
And if you do that, that's awesome. There is a laptop specifically designed for the Raspberry Pi. But I mean, I like that idea of taking some other electronic piece and seeing if you could make something from it.
Right. There are projects out there like the Pi Top, which was released a
Yes.
couple of years ago. It's
I've
a
seen that.
3D printable plan that you can download that is a shell, and then it comes with the parts to turn your Raspberry Pi into a laptop.
Hmm.
But that solution's about $300.
Yeah.
This, I pay $50 for the laptop, and I paid about 20 more in adapter cables that I used to splice together to create it.
And I keep saying that's one of the things I love about technology for one, but computers, like non-Apple computers, and I don't want to harp on Apple, but Apple takes the fun out of tinkering. But Windows non, I guess Windows based or Android based or whatever, but computers that you can like. So what if I do this? Can I do this? Can I do this? I like that. Like I thought of, well, can I take a HP Pavilion case and put new parts in it? I don't want to go um, the obvious route of putting an APU in it that has the GPU and the CPU on it. Is like that's obvious and wasteful of curiosity and wasteful of trying to do something awesome. I still want to put a 240 millimeter AI, either an AIO, two AIOs for the one for the CPU and one for the GPU. It'd have to be two 120s or a 240 all-in-one open loop like the EK 240G because I currently have a GTX 1070 in the Pavilion. That is the goal, is to make it look like store-bought junk on the outside and be able to run either a 1440p monitor or high frame rate gaming, and also VR setup, so I can take it to a LAN party. And it's like, well, this is the only money I can afford to buy a computer, and then set it up and be able to take the side panel off. Is like it's awesome, and either um, not RGB inside because don't want to show through fan um, the fan holes and stuff, or I mean just look awesome on the inside. It's like that and like all the other stuff that people can do with, shoot, 3D printers are amazing for making stuff that you wouldn't even think of. That's it's, I just keep saying that this is the awesome thing about computers and technology, that there's a maker community and people made some amazing stuff. Same
Yeah.
thing with the Raspberry Pi.
Yeah, the maker and the modding community in both the PC and the Raspberry Pi communities is really inspiring. And it's something that I would advocate anyone who's interested to look into.
Hmm.
It's well worth the time.
Yeah.
And while I'm sure we could spend the rest of the evening recording about our love for the Raspberry Pi and the various maker projects that it allows you to make, we do have something that probably our audience is a little more anticipated
Yeah.
for, and that is we want to discuss NVIDIA Super, AMD's Radeon RX 5700 series, and the new AMD Ryzen 3000 series. And so, just before the 4th of July holiday here in the States, NVIDIA on July the 2nd released their new RTX 2070 Super and RTX 2060 Super cards. And so I want to share this article from AnonTech, just as to act as kind of the background for this discussion. We're not going to go through the whole thing because they do a very in-depth review of this device, of these devices. But just to give, of course, we have here the whole RTX 20 series lineup. And we've talked about before on this podcast about the problem with GeForce RTX 20 series pricing. And that's that it is utterly ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Super lineup helps to correct some of that.
Yeah.
So we're starting to see the performance we kind of expected at the initial launch, I think, as a community, finally filter down to where it should seem to be price-wise. Not 100%, but in general. With the release of the Super cards, which so far only the 2060 and the 2070 Super have been released, the 2080 Super is supposed to be coming, I believe, toward the end of the month. The 2060 Super is taking over relatively the same price, or relatively the same performance bracket, I should say, as the RTX 2070, but is doing so at $100 cheaper. Likewise, the RTX 2070 Super is roughly taking over the slot previously occupied by the original RTX 2080, but for about $200 cheaper. And the new RTX 2080 Super is supposed to be having performance similar to or between the RTX 2080 and 2080 Ti, but for the same price as the original RTX 2080 at $699. And so we are seeing an improvement in the value of the RTX 20 series. Now, does that mean they are the best value for the money? Well, we'll get to that. But I am glad to see that Nvidia realized the biggest stumble with the RTX 20 series was the pricing.
Mm-hmm.
Although it does make me feel really bad for all the people who went out and bought RTX 2070s and 2080s and now realizing that their cards are end of life and obsolete. I mean, the performance they're going to get
Yep.
out of those cards isn't going to change. But man, to have a product you purchased be end of life less than a year after it's released, that's rough.
Yep. And the shady thing that Nvidia did with the super line versus the non-super line is really interesting.
Yeah, so let's take a look at some of the performance specifications. So this compares the RTX 2080, the RTX 2070, and the RTX 2060 to their new RTX 2070 and 2060 Super counterparts. And so, some things to note. The RTX 2070 fits roughly in the middle between the 2080 and the 2070, and the 2060 Super fits roughly in the middle between the 2070 and the 2060. And of course, you'll see the new 2060 Super has just as many rasterization units, ROPs, as the original 2070. Because the RTX 2060 is literally just a cut down 2070 die.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike the original 2060, which used a different die to start with. And notice, the RTX 2060 has a 192-bit bus. That's because it's based on, do they show that here? Yeah. It's based on TU-106, but it's a vastly cut down TU-106.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what we are seeing is the 2060 Super are basically original RTX 2070 dies that didn't quite make the cut as 2070s.
Would you say that this is more like, the old hat and game of rebranding and slightly upgrading?
One could certainly make that argument. I remember back
It's
over
like
a decade ago at this point.
rebranding up is what it seems like, not just like we're taking a 380 and making it, or not a 380, a 280X and making a 390. Just and slightly overclocking. It's like, yeah, like you said, taking the 2070 and slightly underclocking it and calling it a 2060 Super. So it seems to me at least, it's like rebranding up instead of
Well, I
put it
remember
this
the
way,
times about a
or
decade ago
rebranding
at this
down or something.
point
Rebranding down, I would say.
where we had the 8800 GT, then we had the 9800 GT with a few minor tweaks, and then we had the same GPU rebranded as the GTS 250
Yeah,
from Nvidia. Now, AMD is not innocent of this either.
yeah.
We saw the R9 285 become the R9 285 became the R9 380X.
Yeah.
You know,
The
we
7870 or the 7890, or I think it might have been the 7990, was rebranded as like the one of the
oh
200
yeah,
series
the
cards.
the Radeon HD 7970 and 7950 were rebranded as the R9 280X and R9 280,
Yeah.
which were solid cards for their time,
Mhm.
but yeah, this feels a bit different. It does feel like a bit of a rebrand.
Mhm.
And I think this is NVIDIA trying to do a bit of damage control. Um, one of the one of the content creators that I follow pointed out that NVIDIA's financials for the last couple quarters are significantly down from where they were at this time last year under Pascal
Mhm.
when they were selling the 10 series still. And that's because most gamers looked at the RTX 20 series, looked at the prices, looked at the relatively minor performance increase compared to the 10 series and said, nope, no thanks.
Yeah.
Except for, I don't mean to use this term derogatorily, except for the whales, the ones who could afford an RTX 2080 Ti at $1,200. Because that was the only thing
There's
that provided a huge performance uplift over the 10 series.
I mean it's the people who want a future proof possibly, or the people who just need the latest card that comes out as soon as it comes out, or the bragging rights. I mean, it's the same kind of people who've had, and I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying if you have the money, do it if you want to. It's the people who had the 980 Ti and quad SLI, or the GTX 1080 Ti and dual SLI, when SLI really wasn't in the 10 series. It wasn't really necessary, and then 9 series, it was definitely bragging rights. Um, or I wonder what I can do with the awesome paying job that I have, which is cool. If you have the money, cool. I'm not saying it's bad or anything. It's just I have my reactions to it.
Right. It's not the best value for the money.
Right.
I
And
mean,
there's only like, I think 10 or around 10 games that even took advantage of SLI in the 10 series. And so it was not really necessary. I mean, if you're a content creator, yeah, cool. It's probably cheaper than getting a Titan card.
yeah, there was a time, again, about 10 years ago or so, where SLI actually made a difference, where there
Yeah.
was actually an economic case to be made where I could buy a 60 series card now and another one when they're about $100 cheaper a year or two from now. And that will give me the performance scaling I need until I can afford a card 3 generations down the road.
Well, before the 9 series came out, like the 960 is what I went up to before I got the 1070 on the really good discount, several discount codes. Um, I bought two. I bought two 1080p IPS monitors from a friend, and he also sold me. No, I got something. Anyways, from another gamer friend online, I bought two MSI GTX 760s. He was running them in SLI mode, and I was going to do the same thing because he said that, like, SLI back in the day, uh, one half of the screen horizontally is one card, and then the bottom half is the other card. So rendering them together is like double performance kind of thing.
Well, that
Um,
was always the promise. It never quite worked out
yeah,
that way, but
right. Yep. And you would think that, oh, I have a 4 gig card and another 4 gig card, so it should equal 8 gigs. No,
nope,
it's still 4 gigs.
indeed. Yeah, I there was a while I ran two GTX 460s
Hmm.
in SLI, and those cards were screaming good in that setup. Now,
Yeah.
eventually, I traded one of those cards and upgraded to a 560 Ti 448 core, which was basically a GTX 570 with one texture unit cut out. And that was a much more, it wasn't as fast, but it was a much more smooth experience than the SLI 460s.
The only really craziest thing that I did was had a Radeon 7870, I believe. I think I still have it somewhere. Uh, or a previous Radeon card with Eyefinity. So I had three 27-inch monitors set
Mm.
up, and I didn't like that because if you're not sitting far enough back, you're like, so there's my health meter, there's my ammo, here's all, here's all of somebody, and you're like, God, I can't keep up.
Yeah, that's why I didn't use a whole lot of those surround setups during that time period, although they were pretty neat to look at.
And another fascinating thing is, I remember when um, Nvidia said we have 3D vision. I don't think anybody really bought into 3D vision because
Well,
they had the glasses, and you could like have 3D like the 3D movies nowadays.
well, yeah, because it had to be implemented by the pub or by the developer. And most of the developers kind of took a look at that tech and said, no, that doesn't look like it's worth it for us.
Yeah,
But to keep us from rabbit trailing too much further, the key thing I wanted to note, the original RTX 2070 was using the TU-106 die, the same as the RTX 2060 and 2060 Super. However, the new RTX 2070 Super uses TU-104, like the RTX 2080.
hmm,
And in this regard, the RTX 2070 becomes much more a traditional 70 series card from Nvidia, which is typically just a cut down version of the 80 series card. Of course, we know now the RTX 2080 Super is coming, and it's going to be based off the TU-102 die that's used for the RTX 2080 Ti. So, who knows where that'll go? The point
yeah,
being, you can see the difference in the TDPs. The 2070 was originally a 175 watt card. just like the 2060 Super is now. The RTX 2070 Super is a 215 watt card, just like the original 2080 was. So I think you kind of hit the nail on the head when saying this is branding down to make them more palatable to the market.
Yeah, but here's that interesting weirdness is go back up a little bit.
Okay.
The pricing. The 2060 Super is $50 more, but the 2070 Super is the same price as the 2070. That was one of the things that was all the tech YouTubers were talking about. It's like, this is really weird. It's not exactly. I mean, you're getting effectively a 2070 at $100 cheaper, but is it really good value when you can get you go just 100 more and you get essentially a 2080?
Right. And I think this is Nvidia kind of backing itself into the corner uh, from price perspective, because on their low end, they can't move the price of the RTX 2060 much lower, because if they do, it'll start hemming in on the territory of the GTX 1660 Ti.
Oh yeah.
And
Okay.
so they needed something in that $350 slot. And so that's why, of all the original RTX cards, the only one they're keeping is the 2060.
But if they're retiring the 2060, the non-super brands, why not just keep the same 349 for the 2060 Super? Because they did it for the 2070 Super.
You would think that would make sense, but in this
I mean,
case, my guess is they can't sell the RTX 2060 Super at a high enough margin at 349 to justify its production.
well, not only that, but if they're trying to get rid of all of the non-super, this doesn't make sense for the 2070 and 2070 Super. But if they're trying to get rid of all of the 2060s, then they wouldn't make the 2060 Super 349, because who would buy a 2060 when they could buy a 2060 Super at the same price? So that makes sense. Like, hey, if you don't want to, if you can't, or you don't want to spend $50 more, or yeah, $50 more, then buy a 2060. It still just doesn't make sense because it's the 2060 Super is effectively a 2070. So it's like, I am confused. What are you doing?
Well, to further the confusion, let's take a look at the announced but unreleased specifications. The RTX 2080 Super is unreleased as of yet. It's launching on the 23rd, like they mentioned here,
Hmm.
but we do know the specs for it. 3072 CUDA cores versus the original 2080's 2944. 1650 megahertz for the base clock, 1815 for the boost, 15.5 gigabits per second GDDR6, 250 watt TDP. That's the biggest red flag for me, is
Yeah.
that the TDP is jumping from 215 to 250 watts with that clock jump and that increase in CUDA cores, which Turing was already hot to begin with.
Hmm.
Now, it is remarkably efficient, but it is still hot compared to previous generations of NVIDIA cards.
I would think that that would definitely need at least 3 fans or full liquid cooling block.
Well, NVIDIA apparently disagrees because this is the RTX 2080 Super Founders Edition.
Yeah,
So
this is
take that as you
2
will.
fans. Well, the thing I've learned about that cooler is there's the vapor chamber. There's the two fans that feed into a vapor chamber. So vapor chamber gives a little bit more cooling capacity than just an AIB shroud that has two fans that has heat pipes.
Yeah, it's, with we'll talk a little bit more about reference coolers when we get to Navi and the RX 5700 series because, well, the reference coolers on those are a bit underwhelming.
Yeah.
But I mean, I've watched Gamers Nexus teardowns of these, and these coolers from Nvidia seem almost deliberately over-engineered.
Yeah.
And so
I remember that one video that he got really mad.
that he did. Yes, there were some things uttered that we can't repeat on this podcast.
Oh, yes.
And so all of that is to say, you'll notice I've skipped to the closing thoughts from Anon Tech, and I also skipped over that GPU pricing chart because, although it was true at the time, it is no longer that those prices are no longer the case. But we'll get more to that when we talk about the RX 5700 series. So, with that said, what the new RTX series represents for gamers, in my opinion, is Nvidia acknowledging that they messed up with the RTX launch. They completely misread the market, and they had to do something to counter the value proposition of the RX 5700 series. And so this was their preemptive shot at that. And if AMD had not lowered their prices as they did, it probably would have been a kill shot. But with the price changes Nvidia or that AMD made, suddenly the RTX 2060 and 2070 Supers don't look quite as good a value as they did this time a week ago. But the good news in all of this is that this competition means for those of us who are looking to buy graphics cards, because don't get me wrong, I love my RX 480s, but it's time for an upgrade.
Yeah.
And so this competition, this kind of competition between Nvidia and AMD is good for us, the consumers.
You know something else about that? We don't even have the Intel GPU yet.
Yes,
So it's going
2020
to
is
get.
coming.
So the GPU battle is going to get spicier when the I think it's the X. No, it can't be the XT. It's
XE.
That's it. XE is going to come out. That's going to be interesting. Hopefully.
Yeah. Will Raja Gaduri finally be able to do it over at Intel with what he tried to do with Vega and failed?
Especially with all the people that they pulled over to their GPU team. They should have something really compelling. So we'll have to find out when that comes out and
Yeah.
the benchmarks and everything.
Yeah, I can't wait to see how that does. So we've got a couple other articles here about the RTX 2070 2060 Super. In particular, we included a review from TechSpot, which is done by Steve Walton, who is also the lead over at Hardware Unboxed, the YouTube channel. One of my favorite. He is, if you want to take a look at how those cards look in gaming benchmarks, this is the article to check out. It's down in the description below in the one tab link that I've included in the description. I'm trying to remember how many games did he test. I think it was a dozen for the initial test, and he's working on, it was a dozen for the initial test, and he's working on a follow-up piece, one of his classic 36 game benchmark suites. So that's why I included the link to that review. We won't go over all of it, mostly because at the time when he released that one, it didn't contain the RX 5700 and 5700 XT. But needless to say, the numbers initially looked good for the RTX 2070 and 2060 Super, but I did find it curious the kind of underwhelmed response that a lot of the YouTube tech press community kind of gave to the Super lineup, which made me a little suspicious, at least until the RX 5700 and 5700 XT reviews started coming out, and then I realized why. I realized why the response was so tepid. So heading back over to a non-tech again, because I'll be honest, I'll have a little bit of a fanboy moment here. A non-tech does some of the best deep dives from a technical perspective, in my opinion, of any of the sites out there. And so the title here says it all. The AMD Radeon RX 5700 XT and 5700 review, Navi renews competition in the mid-range market. Because let's face it,
It's
as good as Polaris was, Vega was not competitive in a lot of ways. It was too hot. It used too much power. It was a wonderful compute card, but it wasn't very good as a gaming card.
Here's the question I have, though. This says mid-range. I'm like, I thought the 5700 and 5700 XT were supposed to be the top of line Navi cards.
For Navi, for small Navi. Remember, there's been talk that there's going to be a big Navi later.
Okay.
So
these are the mid-range GPUs?
The thing to remember is Navi 10 is designed as the replacement for Polaris.
Okay.
So these are the successors to the RX 480, 580, 590.
Okay.
In fact, as was pointed out by another content creator I follow, if you look real closely at the slides from the original AMD presentation at E3, you'll notice on several of the renders that they used for the RX 5700 and 5700 XT, it actually says RX 680 and 690 on them.
Interesting.
And so they've got the renders there of the cards. Of course, the 5700 XT has the fancy little artistic bump, whereas the 5700 has just the standard blower style cooler.
Yep.
As the joke went, the 5700 XT comes pre-dented for Linus, so that he doesn't have to drop it.
Oh my god.
Oh. So, let's take a look here at the specifications. AnandTech correctly places these next to the RX 590 and 570, because that's kind of what they're supposed to be the replacement for. So, we can see Radeon RX 5700, again, it uses a totally different architecture, a whole new, the RDNA architecture. But it has the same number of stream processors as the RX 590, and likewise the RX 580. But notice it has twice as many rasterization, or ROP units. It comes in at a similar base clock, but much higher boost clocks. It's on 7 nanometer.
And it's got a gaming clock.
Yeah. The gaming clock is kind of a new thing, and it's something I'm glad AMD included. It's basically AMD saying, look, the base clock is the absolute minimum you should see out of this card. The game clock is what you'll see most of the time while gaming or putting it under a significant load. The boost clock is this is as much as it will max to under certain situations. I believe the exact phrase they used was opportunistic power boosting. In other words, it will ramp up quickly to that top speed for a short period of time, then come back down again. And so notice the increase in power here. The 5700 has a FP32 throughput of 7.95 teraflops. 7.95 teraflops is more than the RX 590, and yet this is supposed to be the replacement for the RX 570. Likewise, the 5700 XT has 9.75 teraflops of FP32 throughput. So we are seeing a massive jump in throughput at roughly the same power budget. Now, the 5700 and 5700 XT both run a little bit. The 5700 runs hotter than the 570. It's 30 watts at 180 watts, but the RX 5700 XT is at the same 225 watt typical board power as the RX 590. But notice they do start a tad more expensive. The RX 5700 XT is $399. Notice that is $50 cheaper than the $449 that was originally announced at E3. And the 5700 is at $349, which, again, was originally announced at $379. So it's $30 cheaper. And so some of the technology differences with Navi that they talk about, it has the new RDNA architecture. It does support PCIe 4.0, so it is the first GPU to do that, or the first consumer-grade GPU to do that, I should say. They moved to GDDR6, and they're on the 7-nanometer process. And so this is why I skipped over the pricing guide earlier. Notice you have the 50th anniversary edition with its, I think, tasteful gold accents. They could have went all gaudy, like the Sapphire RX 590 anniversary, which is literally just this super bright yellow gold shroud for the entire thing. But I think this black shroud with the gold accents is very tasteful. But I don't think it's $50 more than the base model tasteful. So, but yeah, those new prices of $349, $399, and $449, I think, are much more in line. And I think that's part of why Navi is shaking up the mid-range as much as it does. And so you see this new pricing comparison that they did since then. And so I'm going to jump to the end again. And the key thing I wanted to point out from this article here in the closing thoughts is this chart. And that is the performance summary chart. Notice how they point out relative to their competitors in the stack. The 5700 XT versus the RTX 2060 Super, which is what it was kind of designed to fight, at $399 gives you 11% better performance, so that you have 11% better performance per dollar. Obviously, they're the same price, and so the two of them, the 5700 XT gives you 11% better performance. Likewise, the 5700 compared to the original 2060 gives you 12% better performance at the same price. And finally, the RTX 2070 Super is 5% faster than the 5700 XT, but it's also 20% more expensive. And so the 5700 XT in that matchup gives you 19% better performance per dollar. And I think that's where AMD has a lock of sorts on the sub $500 GPU market. At least if they can keep up the level of to meet demand, I think this performance difference is going to matter for a lot of people. For people who are driven by performance per dollar, the 5700 and the 5700 XT are undeniably the GPUs to get. And so, suffice it to say, I could go through all the charts here. But like I said, we're including the link down below in the description if you want to look through those charts yourself. I think that performance summary sums up the entire idea well. The 5700 XT is 11% better performance per dollar compared to its direct competitor, the RTX 2060 Super. Relative to the next card up, the 2070 Super, yes, it is 5% slower than the 2070 Super, but it's not because it costs 20% less while only being 5% slower. That means it's 19% better value, 19% better performance per dollar. I mean, if you set two cards in front of me and you say, this one's $500 and this other card is $400, but it has 95% the performance of the $500 model, I'm not walking out with the $500 card. So,
and another thing that would be also compelling is if they had, like they've done with the previous cards, buy this card and get 3 games, like 2 or 3 games for free, versus buying a $100 more RTX card and no games.
Well, Nvidia with the super cards is trying to counter that a little bit. They are offering a new bundle with, I believe it's Control and
Right.
Trying to remember, they had the new game Control, and there was one other one they're including. Wolfenstein Youngblood. That's it.
Yeah.
So they are trying to, provide a little bit more value with the super cards. But right now, you can get the 5700 and the 5700 XT with 3 months of Xbox Game Pass for PC. So
Xbox games, you can, yeah.
And Xbox Game Pass for PC lets you download and install any games you want from Microsoft Store and play them, as many of them as you want, during the 3-month subscription period. And then you can extend it after that if you want to. If you'd rather just play a game rather than own it. And so, all of this is to say, the RX 5700 XT and the RX 5700, in my opinion, and what seems to be the consensus among the tech press, is they are the new value leaders in the sub $500 segment. And for that, I'm glad to finally see a competitive AMD that isn't on the back foot.
Yeah.
And hey, competition is good for all of us. I understand not everyone likes AMD cards. Some people, they are Nvidia loyalists and they want to have their Nvidia cards. Likewise, you have AMD loyalists who will only buy AMD cards.
Yep.
But regardless, when you have two companies that are competitive with one another, then we all win because we get better products at better prices.
Hmm.
Speaking of better products at better prices, let's take one last look over at non-tech, but this time let's talk about the other major launch that AMD had on the 7th, and that was their Ryzen 3000 processors. All right. So one last time over to non-tech, they are reviewing the 3700X and the 3900X. Now, the 16-core 3950X is not out yet. It won't be out till September, I believe. So for now, the 3900X is at the top of the stack with 12 cores and 24 threads. Now, the Ryzen 3000 chips are AMD's first big step since the original Ryzen release. Yes, you had Zen Plus with the Ryzen 2000 series, and they did produce about 10 to 15% performance improvements. But Ryzen 3000 represents a huge performance jump, especially over the first gen chips, but also a significant one over Ryzen 2000. And so they have made some notes here. And I wanted to bring these up because I want people to be realistic about buying into a new architecture. When you have a new architecture on new motherboards, weird things happen. They mention here that on the 8th, they noticed large frequency boost behavior changes with motherboard firmware changes that arose due to some bugs that were found early on. So they had to update some of the article benchmarks to do so. They note that on the 9th, they had seen anywhere from 3 to 9% improvements in single-threaded workloads with the 3900X. And also with the 3700X after these BIOS revisions. So, again, brand new motherboard line, brand new processors. Yes, they're built off a similar architecture to what came before, but remember, you're always going to have teething issues. And anyone who was part of the original Ryzen release in Ryzen in 2017, as I was, understands that with a new architecture comes lots of teething issues. And that was the case here as well. AnonTech does helpfully provide this CPU lineup for the whole Ryzen 3000 series that's been announced so far. From the Ryzen 5 3600 down here at the bottom at $199, all the way up to the 3950X at $749. But what they test in this article is the Ryzen 7 3700X and the 3900X. Now, I'll admit, I came into this thinking, oh man, the 3900X, that's the one I'd be interested in. It would be a huge upgrade over my 1800X. But to be honest, after reading through, and I would encourage our viewers to do the same, I'm actually kind of considering an almost a side grade to the 3700X. Because in some of the benchmarks I do want to show, even though it has the same 8 cores and 16 threads, The 3700X actually beats up pretty hard on my 1800X. So let's see. There was a particular benchmark I did want to show off. I believe it was in the rendering tests. Okay, yes, this was it. So notice, here's my Ryzen 7 1800X down here. 8 cores, 16 threads. It is capable of processing 3,661,323 rays per second in the Corona benchmark. The 3700X, same core count, running at a 65 watt TDP, is almost 50% faster. Same core count. Significantly higher clocks, yes, but same core count, it's almost... I said 50%. I meant to say almost 40% faster.
Why?
Well,
I was going to ask, why are there two bars for the 3900X?
and the 3700X, remember
Yeah.
when I said at the beginning they had to retest them
Oh, okay.
because of some of the BIOS weirdness they saw in the first couple of days? So the asterisks were the original readings.
Oh, okay. So
But
just
yeah,
like
from
mine, I was a little
3.6
bit.
million rays up to 4.65 million.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, that's almost a 40% jump. Again,
I'm like in that one, I'm surprised and
I'm sorry, you broke up there a bit.
oh, in that Corona benchmark, I am glad that the 3900X was better than the i9 9900K.
But honestly, what floors me is that it wallops
More
even
than a
the
million
Threadripper
more.
chips.
Yeah, that is pretty shocking.
It just goes to
And the
show you the
enthusiast level
efficiency.
i9.
I was going to say,
Yeah.
it just goes to show you the efficiency improvement that comes from moving to 7 nanometer.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the
Same
1800X
thing with Lux.
with Luxmark, the 1800X down here at 3,843, roughly on par with the 9700K, which has 8 fewer threads, versus the 3700X, also with 8 cores and 16 threads, is hitting 5,225. Again, that's an increase of roughly 1,400 points.
Hmm.
Which, that's what? 7/19, which is almost 40%. And of course, these are heavily multi-threaded tests. In the single-threaded, we don't see quite as dramatic a change, but it's still significant. In Cinebench R15 single-threaded, the Ryzen 7 1800X hit 160 Cinebench score. 3700X, even when retested, hits 204. Even in single-threaded benchmarks, that's almost a 20% uplift.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I won't go through the rest. But their conclusion here, I think, sums it up very well. It is just shy of the very best, but overall is the absolute winner. They talk about in the gaming benchmarks in particular that, yes, Intel is still faster and quote-unquote better at gaming from a CPU perspective. But if you were to set the two machines side by side, unless you were someone who was really sensitive to frame rate, you probably couldn't tell the difference between the 3900X and the 9900K. And so they do note that it's not a perfect win for AMD. They note that in order to facilitate this higher core count on the mainstream node, or on the mainstream chip, they had to make some sacrifices with memory latency. Nothing significant, or nothing that would be significant to the average user, but things that but in some tests, it does show up that there is a bit more memory latency, although there's much better throughput than the original Ryzen parts. And so, as they point out here, in the majority of controlled tests, AMD has done something they haven't been able to achieve in almost 15 years. That is to have a CPU microarchitecture with higher performance per clock than Intel's leading architecture. Admittedly, Zen 2 finally achieves this symbolic mark by a hair's margin, with the new core improving IPC by 10 to 13% compared to Zen Plus. But they also point out, having said that, Intel still very much holds the single-threaded performance crown by a few percent. Intel's higher achieved frequencies, as well as continued larger lead in memory-sensitive workloads, are still goals that AMD has to work towards, and future Zen iterations will have to further improve in order to have a shot. But suffice it to say, everything tied together, they call it a win for AMD. They're, as they say, they are outstanding all-arounders. And so they give it a Silver Choice Editor's Choice Award.
Yeah. That's pretty good.
Okay. Of course, again, with a brand new architecture, some of the testers of this wanted to see if the new architecture could overclock. And they've largely had their efforts stymied by the fact that, well, as AMD's Robert Halleck puts it, who is the senior technical marketing manager at AMD, Ryzen 3000 series CPUs lack much manual overclocking headroom. As I said, as he said over in a explainer on Reddit, Ryzen 3000 series processors do not have much or have very little headroom for manual overclocking. He says, quote, AMD has always focused on maximizing the performance from its processors for the end user. And let's see. Reading from the wrong spot. So, yeah, the other goal of our engineering effort is to absolutely maximize the performance of the product out of the box. By designing algorithms that extract the maximum silicon performance automatically, e.g., Precision Boost 2, without asking the user to tinker or risk their warranty. So no, you're not going to see a whole lot of manual overclocking headroom. That's just performance an average person who doesn't know how to OC can't access. Why would we do that? It's not our intent to leave anything on the table. In general, it's more beneficial to enable PBO, that's Power Boost Override or Overdrive, overclock the fabric, meaning Infinity Fabric, and overclock the memory. So if you were wondering if Ryzen 3000 was going to give you much room to overclock, sadly, the answer to that is no. Finally, one last bit of AMD news, and this actually involves Nvidia as well. Apparently, some Nvidia GPUs were causing AMD Ryzen 3000 systems to have the ever wonderful blue screen of death. According to this, some early Ryzen 3000 series adopters were experiencing random Windows hardware error architecture errors with NVIDIA GeForce gaming graphics cards. NVIDIA was able to collect data from its users and determine what the issue was that was causing the error, and they are going to be releasing a hotfix soon. Basically, they're thinking that on some motherboards that support PCIe 4.0, that the PCIe 3.0 compliant cards from NVIDIA are not playing nice with the new interface. However, if you set the interface to PCIe 3.0, it seems to solve the problem for a lot of users. So it seemed to be more of a software or firmware issue rather than necessarily a hardware one. But NVIDIA has not specified when that hotfix will go live. Okay. Hunter, you still with me?
Yep.
Okay. Let's see. All right. So we've been talking a lot about NVIDIA and a lot about AMD. And we can't forget Intel. Now, Intel hasn't released a whole lot new in recent memory, but they are talking about some new technologies they're looking at as far as packaging. We've discussed on this program before about their EMIB technology, as well as their Foveros 3D die stacking technology. But this article from Tom's Hardware talks about 3 new technologies that they're releasing in the near future. They call them 3 new cutting-edge packaging technologies that they are calling Co-EMIB, Omnidirectional Interconnect, or ODI, and Multi-Die I/O, or MDIO. So some of these will probably sound familiar to AMD users because multi-die I/O is basically what happens with the Ryzen series, where you have an I/O die that handles I/O into and out of the CPU, and then the CPU cores are arrayed around that I/O. And so The three technologies they talk about, EMIB, which is Embedded Multi-Die Interconnect Bridge, is basically a low-cost alternative to an interposer. One of the first implementations we saw of this was in the Hades Canyon NUC, or Next Unit of Computing, which used EMIB to connect I believe it was a Core i7-8807G to a AMD Radeon Vega M GPU on a single EMIB substrate, so that you had a powerful, essentially portable computer. And they mention here that EMIB has the advantage that it is a small piece of silicon that's relatively cheap and provides the same bandwidth and energy per bit advantages as an interposer, whereas versus standard package traces. They also point to Foveros, which is what we've talked about on this show in the past. It's basically a way to stack dies or stack layers of silicon on top of each other, which brings us to co-EMIB. And so basically co-EMIB is using Foveros tech on an EMIB base to create 3D stacked chips to create even bigger systems.
Wow.
So what they showed off was a concept product that contained 4 Foveros stacks, each of them having 8 small compute chiplets connected to the base die. They show a diagram here. You have the circuit board with the package substrate, and then you use what are called TSVs to connect, use it through the EMIB. Notice you have a stack of HBM RAM dies on a base die that's connected via an EMIB to 2 FPGA compute units. Next, they talked about ODI, which is omnidirectional interconnect. So this is a multi-chip interconnect where, according to them, it permits both horizontal and vertical transmission of data. So they show here, and I'll expand this. You have traditional MCP. Traditional or standard MCP is multi-chip, a multi-chip package, a traditional multi-chip package. And they show how the maximum number of interconnects you can have on each of these technologies. EMIB is an improvement over standard MCP, but it's not as good as Foveros or what they're calling ODI. It allows you more, to use the measure they did, bumps per millimeter squared. And basically what it does is allows for current conduction through the package substrate so that resource and memory latency is lower. Finally, they talk about MDIO, or multi-die I/O. And so this is an iteration of a previous technology they had called Advanced Interconnect Bus. What this does is it increases pin speed from the 2 gigabits per second that AIB had to 5.4 gigabits per second. And they talk about how they donated the original Advanced Interconnect bus as a royalty-free interconnect standard to DARPA. It's pretty neat.
Yeah.
So notice the difference that they talk about here. With MDIO Gen 1, and then what they're calling LipenCon from TSMC is supposed to be, I believe, the second generation of multi-die I/O. And so, all of this means that Intel is not just sitting idly by as AMD works on their new designs. They're working on ways that they can do the same thing, but in their opinion, better. Whether it's through these EMIB, these through multi-die I/O, or one of the other methods here, they think they have the opportunity to make this work. All right. So I originally had a different article for this one. There was a big leak this week, or a big supposed leak, about the 10th generation Comet Lake CPUs. Hunter, you saw this one before I did. Care to take a stab at it?
Yeah, the originally I thought this was supposed to be for the mobile devices because they said that it was going to be for the mobile devices. Then they changed it to then the leak changed to this is the new desktop GPU because of Ryzen 3000 series. The interesting thing I saw about this in the leak that has actually been talked about by multiple sources, so it's not just one person saying, like the traditional way would be it comes from a Chinese source, it's possibility of being true. One person talks about it on YouTube saying it's a possibility. I saw it being talked about from multiple places. My three One of my three PC builder, I think it's the PC enthusiasts and builders group on Facebook, were talking about it. They were saying, well, it's leaks, it's possibility of being true, it may not be true. But the interesting thing I saw about it that I was finally excited about, um, I build a expensive Intel build, but the i3 is 4-core 8-thread. So all the CPUs, if this is true, all the CPUs are hyper-threaded. It's like finally, and they did it the right way that me and Ned and Jason talked about previously, where they had them cascading into or like ascending into core and thread difference. So it's not like the i5s are directly competing with the i7s. So they have, and what it looked like they're doing is competing with the Ryzen SMTP or SMT um, chips. So the i3s are 4-core 8-thread, the i5s are 6-core 12-thread, the i7 I think, and I no yeah the i7 is 8-core 16-thread, and the i9 is 10-core 20-thread. It's like, and it only took you 10 generations to figure this out. Of course, it also took Ryzen to get them on the ball rolling of doing this. Because with the 4-core 4-thread, just like with Ryzen, you can build, if that's all you can afford, you can build a decently good gaming or pretty good gaming build for a budget build with a like a 570 an RX 570 or back in the day with the 1400, with the 460. Um, so a good budget gaming build. Now you can do a better budget gaming build with an i3 10 series, with it being four core 8 thread. Um, so that's one thing I saw that was really interesting about it. There are some people who say that 4 cores aren't enough gaming currently, but if you still have older games, this is pretty compelling to me, at least.
I mean, I remember it wasn't that long ago where people were still building builds with the Intel Pentium G4560, which was a
Oh yeah,
two-core, four-thread part,
oh
which
yeah.
was considered solidly entry level, but that was almost 3 years ago.
I saw somebody have, like, you wouldn't think that somebody would put an AIO, a 120 millimeter AIO cooler on it, but I saw one on a build on a PC part picker. It's like, why would you use that CPU, or even a low powered i3? It's like, why would you do that? It's like, well, for either looks cool or try to push performance. But yeah, with this being, and if the i3s, I believe they're probably locked. Um, that would make the Ryzen still be slight advantage over um, the 10 series, the Comet Lake, because the four core the 4 core 8 thread is overclockable.
Well,
I have to find the
well, the details as presented here certainly did cause quite a bit of stir. Unfortunately, there's a reason Mr. Chacos titles the article Take That Comet Lake CPU Leak with a Massive Grain of Salt. It would be
right.
wonderful if Intel would do this. And honestly, I think it would be helpful to their bottom line if they did. But as Brad points out here, there's a number of things that seem off. Uh, it seems like this was probably written by someone in Europe because they put the dollar sign after the prices instead of before, which is a
Mm,
distinctly European idiosyncrasy that Intel generally does not do in any of their official stuff. Again,
right.
notice $129 sign, $149 sign.
Yeah.
Second, they include a lithography column showing the chips being built using 14 nanometer triple plus manufacturing process. While that probably would be a fair way to describe it, I don't think Intel would try to highlight this fact.
Yeah.
They have a maximum all cores turbo frequency listed, but Intel generally has not provided that for either the 8th or ninth generation CPUs.
Mm,
In fact, most of the time when they list a boost clock on one of the new generations of CPUs, it's the single core boost clock. In fact, the only exception to this has been the 9900KS, which Intel guarantees will hit 5 gigahertz on all cores.
yeah.
It includes a code name column, which is, again, very odd for Intel. They generally don't do that. The slide does not have a column for Optane memory support.
Mm,
And, of course, there's the whole fact that they're referred to as the Core i9 10900KF. And some people have been
yeah.
questioning, surely Intel would not use a 5-digit number for their CPUs. If this does turn out to be true, which most of the stuff points to it being a faked leak, because take a look at these official slides for the 9000 series. Well, notice there's some things there that look very similar to the leak, but there's some very significant differences. Likewise, for the 8th gen family, again, notice Intel Optane memory support. No mention of what the architecture is. So that said, although it would be amazing to see these 10th gen Comet Lake rumors be true, take it with a grain of salt. With that said, turns out there's some additional leaks about 10th gen Comet Lake. And these seem a bit more legit. This does come from Chinese forum X Fastest, based out of Hong Kong. These are mostly details about like product roadmaps and the like, which is less about the individual CPUs and more about the lines as a whole. If this leak is accurate, they're claiming that the Coffee Lake S refresh that we currently have will be going through to Q4 of this year with a launch in early Q1 of Comet Lake on a brand new, what they're claiming, LGA 1200 socket. Now, this would not surprise me at all. Intel is notorious for changing the socket they use on their mainstream chipset basically every other generation.
Yep.
You know, we
Every time
had
after the refresh.
so, you know, we had I remember the headache that was the days of 1155 to 1156, back to 1150, then 1151. And that, you know, on the other, they were claiming 1159. This is claiming 1200. On one hand, I understand why Intel does this. You know, changing the pin counts means that you can make the chip or design the chip more efficiently. And I also remember the horror stories of figuring out whether your Socket 775 board would support a given Socket 775 processor, because depending on when it was manufactured, there would be certain Socket 775 processors that would work and certain ones that wouldn't. In particular, the Intel Core 2 Quad Q8000 series was one of the more infamous for not working on older Socket 775 boards, even if you had the latest BIOS. Ask me how I know.
Sounds like you tried it before.
Yeah, the Core 2 Quad Q8400. Solid chip, but a royal pain in the butt. They have this consumer roadmap here as well. I don't think I've ever seen Intel present it in this fashion. So again, take this with another huge grain of salt. But what this leak purports is that the new 400 series motherboards will be able to handle up to 125 watt enthusiasts, 65 watt mainstream, and 35 watt low power processors. And so They have here the platform overview. Again, big grain of salt with the Intel 400 series chipset with PCIe Express 3.0. Apparently, they're not planning on implementing 4.0 just yet. SATA 3, integrated Wi-Fi, Thunderbolt 3, USB 3.1 and 2.0. Dual channel with DDR4 2666 as the default. With Comet like S processors. You get the spiel. Basically, this will be a evolution on the 300 series chipsets and processors rather than anything truly revolutionary. And that brings us to our last bit of the show, where we talk about hardware deals. I honestly thought about including some links to some RTX 2060 Super, RTX 2070 Super, and Radeon RX 5700 and 5700 XTs. But honestly, at this point, given that these are just released products, I would advocate you wait on those. Let them get the teething issues taken care of, iron out the early press driver and public driver problems.
Yeah.
And instead, consider investing in this. This is the ADATA XPG SX8200 Pro. This is a 1 terabyte NVMe SSD that has sequential read-write speeds of 3,500 megabytes per second. It is a PCIe 3.0 4-lane card, meaning it can handle up to PCIe 3.0 times 4 bandwidth. It is in the M.2 form factor, but what makes this a more interesting option than some of the slightly cheaper ones, like, say, Intel's 660p, is that this one has TLC NAND flash rather than QLC NAND flash, which means you can expect a bit better performance and endurance and better performance. For example, the 660p at roughly $95 has a maximum read speed of 1,000 megabytes per second, whereas this is capable of hitting 3,500. Likewise, the write speeds on the 660p are around 700 megabytes per second. This is capable of hitting up to 3,000. And they have a deal going on right now where you can get this 1 terabyte NVMe SSD for your computer for $120. So,
Do we know if the $10 promotional gift card is, I guess you can't use that for the,
not on the order itself, no.
yeah, because it comes after 4 days after invoice. Darn.
So, I've used ADATA SSDs in the past. Back with some of their older M-SATA drives. I had an SX3000, which was an M-SATA drive. It served me well on my laptop for a number of years.
I definitely swear by I definitely approve I have the 2.5-inch drive, but it's the SU 800 512 SSD I've been using for my games, and it's good.
Yeah,
And
it's
this
as
is a NVMe, which is a lot faster than SATA.
yeah. The fact that you can get 1 terabyte of SSD storage now for right around $100 is impressive. I'm pretty sure I've shared this story
For
before.
NVMe too.
Right. I've shared this story before.
Like, this is super impressive. Sorry.
It's okay. I mean, it was not that long ago maybe about 5 or 6 years ago that I was impressed to get a 90 gigabyte SATA SSD for $99 on a Black Friday sale.
Yeah.
I still use that drive, by the way.
Shoot. Shoot, like 2 years ago, this SU 800 512 was $149 on sale. $150 on sale, and now there's 1 terabytes for $100 or less.
So yeah, we are getting near the tipping point where
Yep.
going full solid state storage is actually probably going to be more cost effective than sticking with spinning Rust.
That's one of the plans that I had for my sleeper build, is to have the reason why I bought the B450 Mortar M micro ATX, because it has two M.2 slots. I wanted to have full M.2 slot storage, one for OS drive and media drive, and then one for completely for games, and not have any cable for SATA. Have the option, of course, if I needed to later, but not have any mechanical drives in the system at all, and have all SSD.
Understandable. So that's our hardware deal for the week. ADATA XPG SX8200 Pro. The sale on this, once this goes live, the sale will only have a couple of days left. So if you don't get it immediately, it may pop back up to its normal price of around $190. So keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, we've reached the end of our show. Hunter, do you have anything else you'd like to add or talk about?
Just looking forward to the new stuff coming out eventually, especially the battle between the 3950X and the whatever else Intel is going to push out. I guess the i9 9900K versus the Ryzen 3950X, even though it doesn't really, they don't compare with core clock and core counts and thread counts, but just to see if it can challenge the i9 on the core clock, and especially the overclocking ability. And I mean, and also, of course, to see if the leaks about Comet Lake hold any water.
Yeah, I'd like for some of them to be true, but as I said, I'm going to hold that one with a massive grain of salt because I think it deserves it.
I really want the hyper-threading of all the chips to be true, but there's a lot of listings for the CPUs, and it kind of, in the stuff you pointed out, definitely seems like it's too good to be true.
Yeah, it seems like either Intel would have to be truly desperate or realize just how bad of a position they're in, and I'm not sure they have yet.
Yeah, I mean, they aren't on the clock speed, but I can definitely see them being, yes, on the core clocks, and the cores and threads is what I mean.
Fair enough.
So we'll see.
Indeed, we will. And we'd love to see you come back for our next episode. If you've enjoyed the content you've seen here, of course, you can check us out here at CrossForge Gaming at our various social media sites in the links down below in the description. You can find us over on Facebook, Twitter, and you can find links to our Discord server. If you've enjoyed the content you've seen here, you can also, we have a big list of TechForge previous episodes that you can go back and take a look at. And in the meantime, I've been Ned. This has been TechForge. And remember, when life has you down, Jesus loves you, and forge on.